Look, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming along to what's now the last of the talks in this series. Originally, I was scheduled to be the first of the talks, and I thought that was great because I'd be a nice, soft introduction, nice, sort of a bit warm and fuzzy, and then let all the hard-hitting stuff come later. But coming at the end of the series, I feel very unqualified, I have to say. The talks by Lakin and Camilla, Naomi, and the various guests have been fantastic throughout this program. So I only hope that what I'm going to talk about today is of interest as well. So I will just share my screen. Can I just check that everyone can see what I can see? Full screen slides? Yep. Okay, that's great. I think for the process of what we're doing today, if people have questions, you can fire them through a message in the chat function, but I probably won't see them until the end. If you've got a burning question, just interrupt me. I think we'll play this very casually. That's one. So my talk then is very much a personal perspective. We'll be starting with an introduction. That's where we are now. We'll then have a very broad brush history of Syria. So far in this program, we have been looking at the experiences of newcomers in Northern Ireland and people coming in, and especially sort of a Muslim experience has been a focus. We're sort of flipping that a bit today to look at the history of Syria itself and how its history has shaped its people and modern history. The focus then will be on my own personal reflections on Syria. I worked there between 2002 and 2008 as an archaeologist. I have to state probably here that these are my reflections on Syria and do not necessarily reflect the thoughts and opinions of my employer. So I'll just put that disclaimer in there now. So, who am I and how am I qualified to be giving this talk? I'm currently the Community Engagement Officer for Causeway, Coast and Glens Borough Council Museum Services. Before I joined the museum service though, I worked as a field archaeologist for 13 years. I have a doctorate in archaeology where my focus has been on Syria in what we call the Hellenistic period. That is the time between the coming of Alexander the Great and the coming of the Romans. So it's a period of transition in Syria. As I have here on the slide, my principal research interest is broadly social history, evidenced by material culture. So I look at the material stuff that people left behind and try and work out how they lived their lives. This approach also integrates other evidence types, especially the coinage that was produced, and also literary sources to try and construct this holistic picture of the past. My particular interests focus on political interactions between settlers and indigenous populations, with reference to the relationship between ethnicity, power, and culture. So you can see that even though my academic background is looking very much in the past, there's certain transferable skills there to working here in Northern Ireland. I'm sure that we all know where Syria is, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, here we've got a map of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. We have Syria right here in the center, bordered by Turkey in the north, Iraq to the east, Jordan, Israel and Palestine to the south, and Lebanon and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. Its location here has meant that throughout its history, I should say, just here where the arrow's pointing is the site of Jebel Khalid, and it is at Jebel Khalid that I was working for those years between 2002 and 2008. So, the very earliest settlements around the world occurred in what we term the Fertile Crescent. So the Fertile Crescent is this region here, stretching from Israel in the south and Jordan up through Syria into modern-day Turkey, and then down into Iraq and down to Kuwait. It's termed the Fertile Crescent because even though you have a lot of arid landscape around it, here you have the two great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, and these used to flood every spring and summer, leaving alluvial fertile plains. The cultures that emerged around 10,000 BC in this area, known by its Greek name Mesopotamia, which just means simply between the two rivers, the cultures that emerged had a great impact across here to the Mediterranean coast. And so we get this crescent here of early culture. Around 13,000 BC, we had a hunter-gatherer culture known as the Natufians, who existed in the Fertile Crescent. Their culture developed agriculture for the first time. And with that, we transitioned from a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer civilization through to a Neolithic civilization. Neolithic people essentially are farmers. So the Neolithic package of technology includes agriculture, domesticated animals, principally sheep, goat, pigs, cattle, and dogs. With people settling down, you get land ownership and ownership of structures, of objects. You then get a social hierarchy that becomes stratified. Through that, you get a centralized administration, and you get the development of high and medium density settlements. Also now, because you have people settling down, you have specialization of labor. So you get people who specialize in being potters or farmers or warriors or what have you. So the little map here is just giving indicative dates of the domestication of various grains. We have einkorn, wheat, we have emmer wheat, we have barley. Cattle domesticated late, around 10,000 BC. Sheep and goats about 11,000 BC. Pigs somewhere in the middle. So we have this a convergence in these really fertile areas of different technologies that lead us to a settled population around about 10,000 BC. We term that the pre-pottery Neolithic, which then develops into a pottery Neolithic. So in the pre-pottery, obviously we have people who have settled but aren't yet using ceramics. By 6,500 BC, people have developed ceramics. And at that stage, we have a dominant culture across much of the Fertile Crescent, known as the Halafian culture. And we have Halafian sites up near Jebel, where I was working. It's important, I suppose, to lay the groundwork here talking about the Neolithic Revolution and the Neolithic package, because it has a direct impact on the history of Ireland itself. It's these people from the Halafian period and slightly after that start emigrating up through Turkey, what we would call Anatolia. Just the next slide. And ultimately cross into Europe, bring their Neolithic technology with them. For our Halafian culture, this is the site of Tel Abu Galgal. This is just down the road from the village that we're based in when we were working in Syria. It's a Halafian site, and the mound here, or the tell, is made up from layer upon layer of mud brick buildings. So if you imagine you're building structures out of dried mud every winter, when it rains, some of that mud deteriorates, breaks down from the bricks, and then sort of comes down and forms a layer. And then people build on top of that, build and rebuild, so that you end up getting a tall tell structure, which is just generations of building on top of building. So walking over that tell, there's all sorts of objects that would be sticking out. They're generally a lot rougher than the ones that I've got on show here, but this is just to show you the sort of thing that's being developed in the Neolithic period in Syria. Really beautiful bowls and plates with geometric patterns. Well-developed religious structure with temples in this period already. And then we have figures like this, presumably goddess figurine being created. But as I say, these are the people who ultimately emigrated from Syria up through Turkey and crossed into Europe. And then over a series of several thousand years, the same population groups moved across Europe, bringing their Neolithic technology with them, crossed into Britain, and then ultimately into Ireland. When we look at the genetic makeup of our Neolithic populations in Ireland, and here's an example here, a skull from Ballinahatti, outside Belfast, or between sort of Belfast and Lisburn, and then a reconstruction of the lady's skull, of the lady's head. When we look at the genetic makeup of Ballinahatti woman, for example, almost 60% of her genetic makeup comes from Anatolian Neolithic farmers. So that's the populations that are coming out of southern Anatolia, southern Turkey here, and working their way up through Europe. The remaining 40% is made up of residual DNA from Western hunter-gatherer groups that existed in Western Europe before the arrival of Neolithic farmers. So there is a direct link in this period between Ireland and Syria, and between most of Europe and Syria.
Nic?
Yes.
You are kind of tailing off a wee bit on some of your sentences. There's a wee thing with a sound. If you can just maybe move a wee bit closer to your microphone.
Yep.
Thanks.
Is this a bit better?
Yeah, that's
hopefully
better.
Yep. Okay. So after we get the development of cities and agriculture, that of course ultimately leads, as we know, to the development of metalworking. And from about 2000 BC, we enter into the Bronze Age, where our individual cities develop into states and kingdoms. We then find for the first time really that Syria, rather than being a center of the development of agriculture and technology, becomes a crossroads between other powers. So very much it's lodged here between Europe and Turkey, Africa coming up through Egypt, and Asia coming in Iran. So we find that throughout the next period, what I'm calling the Crossroads Continents period, we really do find that Syria is a mixing pot of different cultures. It very much has its own distinct cultures, but they all share elements of influences that have been brought in by their neighbors, if you like. So very roughly speaking, in this period, we have the Bronze Age running from 3000 BC to 1000 BC, the Iron Age running up to 332 BC, and then we get the start of the Greco-Roman period. So in the Bronze Age, we have the likes of the Sumerians and the Akkadians coming up from Mesopotamia. We have the Hittites coming down from central Anatolia. We have the Egyptians working their way up from the south, from North Africa, and then the Mitanni, who are coming from what's now southern Turkey and northern Iraq, working across as well. And each of these cultures left an impact on the populations of Syria. And these periods probably most clearly seen in the religious iconography that we get coming out. In the Iron Age then, we get the Assyrians, again, from this northern part of Mesopotamia, the Babylonians coming up again from the south, and the Achaemenid Persians coming from what's now Iran to establish what at that stage was the largest empire the world had ever seen. We have Syria then sort of smack bang in the middle of that. In 332 BC, we get the conquest of Alexander the Great. He establishes a very short-lived Macedonian empire, which collapses on his death, and each of his various generals take over parts of the empire. One of his generals, a man by the name of Seleucus, establishes the Seleucid Empire, which controls Syria for the next 300 years or so, before it gets divided between the Parthians, again coming from the east, and the Romans coming in from the west. Towards the end of this period, we get a resurgent Persian Empire under the Sasanians, again coming in from the east. And then in 634, we get the Arab conquest. So again, we see Syria here passing between foreign rival powers time and time again. With the Arab conquest, we get the coming of Islam. These photos show the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. One of the most important mosques in Islam. It also holds the grave or the mausoleum for Saladin, the great Kurdish leader who led the opposition crusades, Third Crusades. It's also said to hold the head of John the Baptist, as well as shrines to the Muslim martyr Hussein bin Ali, and another shrine to Jesus Christ. So you can see that there's a whole mixing of religion going on here within one structure that could be seen from the outside to be very much a singular entity, the Umayyad Mosque, a Muslim monument, a Muslim place of prayer and worship. But as you can see, there's quite a lot going on there as well that is very much applicable to the cultures that came before the Arab conquest. In this period, we then get the period of the Crusades as well. The map here shows various Crusader kingdoms that were set up. Of relevance to Syria especially was the Principality of Antioch, based in the north, the county of Edessa, which is mostly in modern-day Turkey, that comes down into the north of Syria as well. And then you had forces repelling or attempting to repel the Crusaders coming from the Zengids, the Abayids, and the Seljuk Turks, as well as the Fatimids coming up from Egypt. So again, you have all sorts of different influences happening here. This photograph on the left then is one of the Crusader castles, which is still to be found within Syria, Crac de Chevalier, just here. The people who built it were Hospitaller knights, but when the Hospitallers were ejected and the Crusaders were ejected, they left a continuous legacy on the people of Syria as well. You still find Syrians, especially in the north and especially along the coastal areas, who are red-haired and have lots of freckles. And they are, I've heard them multiple times referred to by the people that we worked with in Syria as Franks. And Franks, of course, refers to the French and the Germans who came in the period of the Crusades. Whether there is a genetic link or not, I'm not sure, but culturally, these people are still referred to as Franks. By the 14th century, you get this entire area being dominated by the Ottoman Empire, based out of Turkey. Under the Ottomans, you get a lot of forced relocations of populations within the empire. One of the processes that's often used within empires when you're trying to control an area is you move populations from where they are established to other areas, and you sort of divide and rule in that way. One of the legacies of Ottoman control of Aleppo is this structure here, one of the more famous buildings in Aleppo. It's the Borough Hotel, which was built by an Armenian family that had been relocated to Aleppo. The Borough Hotel was still functioning up until the beginning of the recent war. And on our weekends, away from working, this is where I suppose the leadership of our excavation team would come and stay. We plebs would generally stay somewhere cheaper, but many happy afternoons sat in the bar at the Borough Hotel, where one of the most famous people in the history of the modern area of Syria and the Levant, D.E. Lawrence, stayed, and they still have here, Monsieur Lawrence, his unpaid bar tab was still framed and in the bar there in the Borough. But in the late Ottoman period, you have more and more Europeans coming into Syria. Agatha Christie is said to have written Murder on the Orient Express in the Borough Hotel. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and in order to open up another front against them, the British and their allies supported local Arabs based down in the Hejaz, so that's modern-day Saudi Arabia, to revolt against the Ottomans. And so they supported the Hashemite family of Hussein bin Ali, and at the end of the war, Hussein himself was confirmed as king of the Hejaz, and each of his sons were given different territories to rule, the most important of which were Abdullah, became the emir of Transjordan. He, of course, went on to become the king of Jordan. And Faisal was confirmed as the king of Syria. It was in the reallocation of power that followed afterwards that he was later relocated to become the king of Iraq. Because unbeknownst to their Arab allies, in 1916, just when the British were sort of prompting this Arab revolt, the British and the French signed a secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they divided the territories that they were expecting to remove from the Ottoman Empire between a French and British areas of influence. So you can see here the blue lines on the map. The intention was that the French would take this northern section and that the British would take the southern section. Essentially what's now Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine and Israel, whilst the French would take what's now Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Turkey. In 1920, the territory that had then been removed from the Ottoman Empire was officially partitioned. And at this point, the Prince Faisal was removed from being the king of Syria and relocated to become the king of Iraq. So you can see here that we have a division then of the previous areas of the Ottoman Empire within what was the Fertile Crescent, divided between a British mandate and a French mandate. Syria was within the French mandate, as was Lebanon. In 1948, when Syria was given its independence, Lebanon was kept as a separate entity. It was considered at the time that because Lebanon had a very large Christian community, that it would be kept as a Christian enclave in the Middle East, separate and discrete from the rest of Syria. However, if you look at modern Syrian maps of what Syria looks like, they will include Lebanon officially as part of Syria, as well as Hatay province of Turkey up here. So Syria does not officially recognize that this is part of Turkey or that this is part of Lebanon. So that is a very, very brief introduction to the history of Syria in general. And hopefully the point that you'll take away from that is that Syria up until 1948 was not a single entity, that it had lots of different influences, mostly external influences on it, that have each left a mark on the people and the cultures there. In the West, we tend to think the Middle East is all one, Arabs are all one, Syrians are all one, but it really is not the case at all. So my involvement in the area started back in 2002 when I joined a team of archaeologists working at the site of Jebel Khalid on the Euphrates River that was being led by Professor Graham Clark from the Australian National University. The team had been excavating there since 1986, so by the time that I joined, obviously it was well established. The settlement dates back to the Seleucid period. So this is the empire that was established by Alexander the Great's general. So you've got a Greco-Macedonian ruling dynasty over a territory really extending from all of modern-day Turkey across into Uzbekistan and Pakistan. The settlement itself dates purely within the Seleucid period, established around about 300 BC, and then abandoned about 74 BC. We don't know for sure its ancient name, but it may have been known as Amphipolis or Nicephorus. at the time that it was occupied. So those, of course, are both Greek names for the city. The modern site, Jebel Khalid, it's built on a rocky outcrop known as a Jebel, and Khalid is a personal name. So at some stage, this was known as Khalid's Jebel. So I thought, by way of talking about my experiences, I would take you more or less through the journey from when we would arrive in Syria, the various places that we would go to, with a few insights, and then look at the site itself. I could probably talk for several hours with a lot more confidence than I've done so far about just the history of the site, but we'll keep it fairly brief. So as a team, we'd fly into the capital of Syria, Damascus, located down here in the south. Damascus is probably a really good way to be introduced to the country because it's very, or at the time, it was very modern, very chic, very fashionable, with a whole variety of different people from different backgrounds. And here you can see Syrian walking around, Syrian lady walking without a hijab. Here we have other women more traditionally dressed. So you have a whole variety of different people all living within the same area. So this is just a couple of sort of streetscapes of what Damascus looked like. And of course, all of these photos are before the war. In general, Damascus, as with everywhere in Syria, was just incredibly welcoming walking through it. As I was 21 at the time that I arrived in Syria for the first time. So walking around as sort of a wide-eyed Western kid, it was an amazing experience. The sights, the smells were so incredibly exotic, and yet the people were so welcoming and so happy to have you there. So just some photos here, the souk, or the large marketplace. You can see that it's covered over, so it can be used in all weather. And it's built through the old part of the town, and it's been a marketplace for thousands of years in that area. So a lot of history and tradition there. And you can see here just different spices and herbs and that sort of thing on sale, as well as your usual stuff you'd associate with the Middle East. You have carpet shops, but you also have tire shops, you have metal workers, you have computer and phone shops. You have everything all mixing sort of side by side. But the past and the present all together, an amazing experience. Walking out of that souk, the main entrance here, you actually pass under these ruins. And these are the ruins of a Roman temple to the god Jupiter, the chief god of the Romans. And then opposite that, we have the entrance to the Umayyad Mosque that I had pictures of earlier. And it's just an interesting point, and again, talking about the overlaying cultures that have been dominant within Syria. This same site, this same location where these people are walking, housed originally an Iron Age temple of the local chief god, Baal Hadad. After the campaigns of Alexander and the establishment of the Seleucid Empire, Greeks and Macedonians, there was then a temple of Zeus, the supreme god, built over the top. With the coming of the Romans, that temple of Zeus transitioned into the temple of Jupiter. So again, the chief god of the area. We then have the establishment of a Christian church on the site, and then finally the establishment of the Umayyad Mosque. And as we've seen, the Umayyad Mosque said to contain the head of John the Baptist, as well as a shrine to Jesus. So we have overlaying religions time and time again. And we can see this pattern across all sorts of sites, especially religious sites within Syria. So probably also a good time, especially as I've got a slide here, to talk about the demographics in Syria. So this is according to the CIA World Factbook. Only 50% of, according to the CIA information, only 50% of the population of Syria would consider themselves to be Syrian Arabs. We then have minorities of Alawites, who are a Shia sect. We have quite a few Kurds. We have other Levantines. So they are people of different religions who wouldn't identify themselves as Arabs living in the area. We then have 15% of the population is made up of much smaller groups, such as the Druze, the Ismailis, the Nusaris. We have Syrian Christians. We have Turkmen, probably about 1.5% of the population are Turkmen, left over from the Ottoman Empire. We have a large number of Armenians and Chechens who were relocated again during the Ottoman Empire down into this area. On top of that, there's a population of about, well, before the war, it was about 20 million people in Syria. On top of that, there's more than 500,000 Palestinian refugees who live in more or less permanent camps and have done so since the creation of Israel in the late 1940s. Looking at the religion then, the majority religion within Syria are Sunni Muslims, but 13% of the population are variations of, or variant types of Shia Muslims, the Alawites being perhaps the most important, because it's from the Alawites that the family of Bashar al-Assad, the president, come from. And there are lots of people in higher positions in the government that would also come from the Alawite minority population. About 10% of the population are Christian, about 3% are Druze, and then we also have Yazidis and Jews living there as well. Now, while I was there, you would hear time and time again from different people that everyone lives together in harmony in Syria. And of course, this was before the war. The situation has changed since. But effectively, everybody said, doesn't matter whether you're a Jew, a Christian, a Shia, a Sunni, we all live together and we all get on with it. We're all equal within the law. And there appeared to be, certainly to an outsider, harmony and tolerance between different religions and different ethnicities. Part of that was fear. All of the civilians were afraid of the police. The police were afraid of the army. The army were afraid of the secret police. And you would see signs of it in the streets, certainly. Often a heavy police presence. At army checkpoints on the roads, we would be stopped and we would be prevented from progressing any further unless there was bakshish paid. So there were high levels of corruption. So by no means was it a perfect society. But when speaking with people, you certainly heard that there was a sense that everybody was equal, at least amongst the civilian population. After a couple of days acclimatizing in Damascus, we would head up to Aleppo. Aleppo is the second largest city within Syria. At the time, there were about 5 million people that lived there, and it was the largest city, or the closest large city to our site at Jebel. So on our weekends, it would be Aleppo that we'd come back to. We would work a week running from, what would it be? From Saturday through to Thursday night. On Thursday night, we'd go back to Aleppo. We would spend Friday, the holy day, in Aleppo, and then Friday night, we'd come back to site. Because of the fact that Friday was a holy day, a lot of the shops would be closed, so we would spend a lot of our time in the Armenian quarter. Armenians being Christians, all of their shops would be open. So we'd spend a lot of time in the Armenian quarter, illustrated here. One of the things to see up the top here, and I've got a little bar covering it, so I'll move that. Really interesting as a foreigner from a different culture, going somewhere and seeing how your culture is perceived. Now, the top here is movie poster painted advertising the movie that you can stay in. And you can probably see that there's a fairly one-sided view of what the movie's about. I have to say that from my perspective, as a young male walking around in Syria, there was only ever once that I felt personally uneasy or slightly threatened. And that was when I was visiting a site on one of our days off, and someone approached me, as many people did, wanting to practice his English. We were chatting, and when he found out that I was Australian, he became a little bit hostile because he had spent 3 years in an Australian detention center when he tried to flee as a refugee to Australia. So he was hostile against the Australian government as opposed to against myself as an Australian. But that's the only time that I ever felt in any way uneasy walking around, whether by myself or with a group. The girls that we were working with, the Western girls, had a slightly different experience and would always travel in twos or with one of the guys. And this movie poster here probably sums that up quite well. The movies that, or the perception that a lot of people in Syria would have had of what Westerners were like is based very heavily on TV and movies. You know, I'll throw my hand up and say that a vast amount of what I know or think I know about the United States comes from watching The Simpsons, for example. Okay? So if your perception of what Western culture is like is based on Hollywood, and then even more so on B-grade movies, you'll see that whilst Syrian women tend to be modest and very conservative, it would appear from our movies that Western women are all licentious and up for it. And so you'd get a lot of our girls walking around who would be groped or who would be hassled by the men. So they certainly had a different experience to what I would have had traveling around. But what they certainly found was if they called someone out for doing it, that person would immediately be mobbed by any local women around and sort of smacked and beaten for treating them disrespectfully. Just a few more pictures of sort of Aleppo streetscapes. Again, as I said, all of the shutters for a lot of the shops would be down on a Friday because it was the holy day. But certainly come lunchtime, the food that was available was always marvelous. Great to get away from big food and have some of the local food. And again, truly hospitable and lovely people. The local falafel house that we would visit, it was effectively a hole in the wall. Everybody would line up outside in the baking hot sun, waiting to get their falafels. And if it was properly hot, the owner of the falafel shop would come out and give everybody a bottle of water. So, you know, that sort of truly hospitable nature and culture, I suppose. Moving from Aleppo then, the nearest town to where we were working was a place called Manbij or Membij. Because of the transliteration between Arabic and English, the spelling varies quite a lot. So we would visit Membij, typically if we needed anything that we couldn't get in the local village that we were staying in. Much more of a rural town. The travel writer Charles Glass, who I'll admit had a bit of a chip on his shoulder because he was taken hostage for some time in Syria in I think the 80s, wrote about Membij: if every town on earth were vying for the name nowhere, a mere 2 or 3 could hope to compare with Membij. Truly the smell of the open air meat souk on a hot day was something that I don't miss. But again, coming from a Western society, to walk through somewhere like the meat souk, where you have the carcasses hanging up, you have heads of animals just sort of in the gutter outside, is eye-opening, to say the least. But a really fascinating place to walk through and get the feel for. And lots of classic cars still being driven, things that wouldn't generally still be driven in day-to-day life in Australia or here in Ireland, still being driven in Syria. Very much a make, do and mend society, but it means that you see some fantastic stuff. But if you scratch below the surface in a place like Membridge, you'll see that it's a lot more than just a nowhere town. The ancient sources refer to Membridge as Hierapolis, which is Greek for the holy city. So Hierapolis Bambyke, or the holy city of Bambyke, we have lots of references in ancient texts to it being the holiest and most ancient sanctuary within Syria. One of the big features of the sanctuary at Hierapolis was a big sacred pool where you would go and you would feed the fish. And if you had a particularly important prayer or something you were beseeching the local goddess for, the goddess by the name of Euphrates, you could even swim in the sacred pool across to an island and leave votive gifts there. Where that sacred pool used to be is now the local football pitch. And far off here in the distance, this wall poking out is part of the revetment that would have been around the sacred pool in the Hellenistic period. Local park as well in Membridge, you find column drums, column capitals and bases just lying all over the place. You have a sculpture garden of various sculptures that had been uncovered in the area, various tombstones. So there's still definitely traces there of a fairly glorious past that might not be evident during there today. A lovely basalt lion here in this lower image that the head sadly removed, but the lion was sacred to the goddess Euphrates. So further evidence of her being there. From Membridge then, we would move to Abu Galgal. Abu Galgal is the village that we would live in. And it would have been occupied by, whereas Membridge would have been occupied by a lot of Circassians, people brought down from the Caucasus in the Ottoman period. Abu Galgal was very much occupied by Syrian Arabs. Absolutely quintessential rural village for Syria. And it was in Abu Galgal really that I fell in love with the country, I have to say. You can see here still old traditional mud brick architecture. The roofs, to stop them melting in the rain, covered with sheets of plastic and tires to try and keep the water out and make it watertight. But as you can see, mud brick houses with satellite dishes and telephone lines. So that real combination of the past and the future. Oh, sorry, the past and the present. The people in Abu Galgal were an absolute delight. You couldn't move without having the local children, the local shabab, the sort of young men coming out and just wanting to find out more about where you were from, what you were doing, what you liked, just so curious and so hospitable. Interesting levels of English amongst some of them. Some of them had quite good levels of English from the local school. Some of them knew English phrases, but without necessarily knowing what they meant. A lot of the younger kids, certainly this wee girl here in the photo waving, she used to come up and say, "Hello, Nicholas, what is your name?" So, you know, she obviously knew the greeting, but she didn't know what it was that she was saying. Absolutely wonderful experience. Staying for 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks at a time, living with these families, eating with these families, was a real eye-opening and wonderful experience. Our accommodation was hardly fancy. Rudimentary is probably the better term for it. We hired a compound that was used most of the year to house goats. The front of it had a doctor's surgery, the local doctor, and inside was used either as storage or, as I say, to house goats during the rest of the year. This is Beit Shabab, or the boys' house. This room up here. Upstairs, open to the elements, this little block to the left is an open roofed toilet. If you were standing up there, your head and shoulders would be visible to everyone, but just a little squat toilet for us to use that we then have to have a bucket of water to wash everything away. So really rudimentary stuff, no running water for us upstairs, certainly. Looking down from upstairs, from Beit Shabab, we have sort of the work compound down here, and you can see that rush mats were laid down on the floor to keep the dust down, and then we had sort of trestle tables set up for working away with material that we had excavated. And then the Mudir's compound, or the sort of boss's compound, was across the street, and that's where we would go to eat as a team for our dinners most of the time. So here you can see here with the long trestle table, again laid out with an awning. The family that owned the compound that we lived in, we would have to go through their yard in order to get out. That was the Naif family, the Al Naif family. And we spent many happy lunchtimes and evenings relaxing with the family of Naif, his wife Shalan, and then their 8 children. And really need to pay tribute to them for their hospitality and just how wonderful they really were. Also very good at correcting my atrocious Arabic, and in turn us working with them with their English. A truly wonderful family. This is Shalan in the center here. The lady with the red hijab, or I never quite caught her actual name. I think she was Shalan's wife, sister, but she was only ever introduced to me as Nicholas, which means the mother of Nicholas, because apparently she wanted to adopt me. So, you know, that's the sort of relationship, I guess, that we were all living in there in the village of Gargal. Certainly when we weren't working, we'd spend a lot of time with them. You can see here putting on amazing spreads for us with all sorts of different traditional foods. The photo here in the lower right, we have some of our team, including our chef. Happily on our team, our architect's wife was a pastry chef. So she came along each season purely to cook for us, which was an absolute blessing. But here she is with Shalan, sharing recipes, learning how to cook traditional styles, and then sharing things that she would have done. So again, a lot of interaction there between the dig team and the local village. The site itself now is across here, right on the Euphrates River, Jebel, Khalid. So you can see here, this is a Russian spy photograph from the period of the Cold War, but it shows up the Jebel very nicely. So we have steep slopes coming up from all angles, and then sheer cliffs dropping down to the river Euphrates, which is just down here to the east. To the north of Jebel Khalid, there's Khirbet Khalid, which is a village that was established for the creation of the Tishrin Dam, which is just upstream outside the Borough. And it's the workers from Khirbet Khalid that we employed to work with us on the site itself. So the domestic arrangement in Abu Galgal was kept very separate from the working arrangement. While the people in Abu Galgal were Sunni Arab Syrians, the people from Khirbet Khalid were settled Bedouin. So in the 1920s, under the French mandate, a lot of Bedouin, who were traditionally nomadic, were forcibly settled. And one of the groups were here in Khirbet Khalid. A lot of distrust between the traditional settled populations of Syria and the settled Bedouin and the nomadic group. we had on our team, we had to have a local government representative. And of course, he would always comment about not wanting to be left alone with any of the workers on the Jebel, and certainly not going to their houses after work, because sure, they're Bedouin, they could kill you and then just cross the border and no one would be able to stop them, because the Bedouin retain their right to work across the region and across borders. So there was a lot of distrust between the traditional settled populations and the more recently settled populations. And again, you can see parallels with here in Ireland, it has to be said. So Khirbet Khalid, even more rustic than Abu Galgal, but again, absolutely wonderful people. When our team came during the year, that would be the largest single cash injection that the village would get each year. Outside of that, they lived very much hand to mouth, and a lot of the men would be away at any one time in Lebanon or down in Saudi Arabia, especially, or down in Jordan, finding work elsewhere, doing a lot of seasonal work, things like fruit picking and that sort of thing. So while, again, a lot of Westerners would think that, you know, the women in a country like Syria would be cloistered away and you wouldn't really see them, most of our workforce were the local women, because, you know, that they had to, in order to get the money into the village, the women had to work as much as the men. So here we have Graham, the site director, calling out who is being on which team for the season. We would employ somewhere in the region of 150 people while we were there, broken up into teams, each with an archaeologist from Australia or the UK, then sort of leading that team. I can't state enough, again, incredibly hospitable people. We would share meal times, a lot of our meal times, not all of them, but a lot of them, up on the Jebel itself. And then afterwards, several sort of times during the season, we would come back and various people from our personal work teams would have us just as individually to come and stay at their house and be fed. And so the food was, you know, not as fancy as what we were getting elsewhere, but absolutely delightful and fresh and wonderful. And these really are people who have so little and were so willing and happy to share it with those of us who are coming from country who, you know, for them, even though I considered myself to be a poor struggling student when I started working there, for them, I still came from a very wealthy background, of course. The site itself then, I'll take you on a very sort of cursory tour of what we were excavating. At the highest point of the site, we had the governor's palace, known by the Greek name, the Acropolis, which was an internally fortified wall with a palace structure in the center. Not marked on this plan, we also had probably army barracks on this little tongue of land here. But so this is if you follow the viewpoint of the arrow, this is looking down from the north to the south, where the Acropolis Palace is. And this is the sort of remains that we were looking at down here in the lower photo. So you can see not a lot standing above ground level, but digging below ground level, modern ground level, you can get still the bases of walls, bases of columns, floors. The palace here had an altar for sacrifices, coins, weaponry, that sort of thing inside. The main gate of the ancient city was just here, the west gate. You can see the size of the large limestone blocks that were used to construct the gate. This is the foundation of one of the fortification walls, which would have extended certainly up several meters, but has since been looted and damaged and sort of collapsed. So that's all that we're getting there, the remains of the wall, and you can see more of it here. The ancient gate is still the best access onto the site, so that's still where the modern road comes up. And it's a very well used road, not for the best reasons from an archaeological point of view, But because we have a living village just down at the base of the Jebel here, Khalid, and certainly there's evidence that when they build their new homes, rather than necessarily using mud brick, or rather than chipping new limestone bricks, need to, because they could just come up onto the site, and there were all those lovely preformed limestone blocks that they could take away and use. So there was looting every year of archaeological materials, which were then rebuilt into modern structures. From an archaeological point of view, that obviously is bad. From a sociological point of view, you can completely understand why it was being done. And it's been done throughout history. As you'll see shortly, slides here, even at the time that the site was occupied, ancient pieces of architecture from older buildings were being reused in new forms. So it's a pattern that has continued throughout history. Over on the east then, we have a steep escarpment that leads into a gully. And this is the only way really to get down to the Euphrates River from within the site. So we'd call this the east gate or the water gate leading down. There's remnants of walls down here, but it's all very ruinous and it's hard to make much sense of what it is. Here you can see one of the local shepherds has been watering his flock down at the Euphrates and then making his way back up to the top of the Jebel. During the winter and the spring, the Jebel is very green and it's used really by shepherds. So you get a lot of shepherds reusing the quarry caves as campsites. And there are tombs cut into the cave, into the cliff faces over the top of the Euphrates River. And those are used again as places to camp for various shepherds, as well as toilets, unfortunately. So some of them were a bit stinky. So that's our water gate down the bottom here. And there is evidence before the construction of the Tishrin Dam, when the Euphrates used to flood and then recede in the late summer, there was evidence of some sort of stone quays or jetties going up there. So obviously there was an active crossing of the Euphrates at this point. Up the top, along the northern part of the site, we have then excavated an entire insula or sort of high density housing block. So we've identified streets all the way around it. And you can see hopefully at the above photo, the extent of the remains that have been uncovered, lots of walls still standing, and then all these mounds around those walls are our spoil heaps. So that's the material that we've taken from around the walls during the excavation. In the lower photograph, you should be able to see, again, a series of walls, but then in the foreground, we have a series of large blocks that have come from some sort of civic building and have been reused in the late period on the site to build a garden bed. So this is what I'm talking about. The process of reusing architectural features after that building has gone into disuse is not a new one. And it is a process that has continued throughout history. That housing block then, that we were just looking at, we can actually divide the downstairs of it into 4 different households. So there's a particularly large one, known as the House of the Painted Frieze, here, and then we have 2 smaller houses and a sort of middle of the road house. And you can see here on the right-hand side of it, we have fragments of painted plaster from the walls within this House of the Painted Frieze. It's one of the best preserved areas in the domestic world. And you can see that there's all sorts of elaborate designs. So this is sort of architrave type material here. We have big panels of yellow and black and red. We have these lovely wave designs, floral designs. So the people who lived in these houses, it wouldn't have been the stark sort of mud brick or lime washed walls that you see today in this part of Syria. It would have been very highly decorative. Perhaps my favorite material to come out of these houses, though, are these. And if you can make out what's going on here, these are just the best preserved versions, but we have several of these fragments. Here we have an Eros, or a Cupid, a young boy figure with wings coming out his back. He's sitting in a chariot, and he's holding the reins of a chariot here with goats. So the goats are pulling a chariot that's being driven by Eros, or a Cupid. So we have these absolutely delightful little frieze panels that would have been up in the decoration of the house. So a reconstruction here, we have these big panels at the lowest register, our black, our yellow, our red, and then we move up to the decorated friezes. So here we have our little Cupid chariots, we have our wave and our floral designs, and then upper panels. And the whole intention of these painted walls was to make them look more expensive than they were, to make them look like marble walls of palaces inside a house. And similar decorative designs were being done throughout the Mediterranean world in this period. In Pompeii, in Italy, for example, we have a similar process in the 1st century BC of what their walls would have looked like and the techniques and styles. So you can see there's lots of Mediterranean influences coming in here to the architecture. The structure of the houses themselves were built in a Greek form, these insulae. However, the floors were left as just earth floors. So we presume they would have been covered by rush mats or maybe carpets in the way that the houses of contemporary Abu Galgal and Jebel Khalid are. So we have then, that's something that would not be normally seen in a Greco-Macedonian city or a Western city. So you see, while the architecture is Greek and the decoration is Greek, the floors themselves are vernacular, they're local Syrian. The fine ware ceramics that we were finding, the plates and the bowls and the cups that people would have been using at the table tended to be in Greek styles, but the cooking ware tended to be in Syrian style. So obviously, whilst the people here are living here and dining with the appearance of dining as Greeks, the food that they're eating, and probably the people preparing their food, are not. They're very much going to be a local population. On top of that, one of the most common cooking dishes that you find on traditionally Greek archaeological sites are what we call casserole dishes, which were used for cooking fish. The goddess Atargatis, the great Syrian mother goddess, fish were sacred to her. You were not allowed to eat fish. And at Jebel Khalid, we don't find any casserole dishes. So we don't have evidence of them eating fish. We also don't find anything in the way of fish bones on the site, whereas we do find a lot of sheep goat bones. So you can see that there's a definite mixing going on here within the population of Jebel Khalid. We think that it was probably initially a military colony, fortification to control traffic up and down and across the river. And it looks, well, we can presume that there certainly then would have been a core of Greco-Macedonian males that lived here. But where their women came from, we have no idea. And after several generations, we don't know genetically how Greco-Macedonian the population would have been anymore. We presume quite a lot of mixing. The part of the site that was most, my first season at the site, I worked up at in the domestic water. The rest of my work was focused on the temple area known as Area B, and that's just here near the main gate and near the sea gate as well. And of course, my doctorate was looking at religion in the Seleucid Kingdom, so this formed a key part of my doctorate. We have the remains here then of a lovely little temple. You can see some of it here, some of the foundations, and some of our workers in the lower photo excavating. Some of our team here, you can see that again, because a lot of the men were away, it meant that a lot of the women had to bring their children on the site. So we end up having children helping out, interfering, that sort of thing. It also meant that when things like agrabs and scorpions were found, whereas I would be fascinated and want to look at them and sort of take in what they were because they didn't look like scorpions where I came from, our workers would immediately set about trying to kill them because there were kids all over the place. So, quite important to keep that sort of thing in mind as well. So some of our workers here, we have Ali and Fatayam and Mahmoud at the bottom. Certainly some of the best workers that I had. Absolutely flawless in the heat. And of course, most of them had been doing it longer than me. So they knew exactly what it was that they were doing. I was there to help out occasionally with physical work and really very much more for the recording. They thought it was terribly funny when I wanted to help out with the actual wee itself, because that was not traditionally something that the mudirs, the bosses, would do. Every day they'd come up and down with all of their equipment with them. Some of it would be on the back of tractors, some of it they'd carry on their heads, as you can see. More of the kids up on site. And of course we have the shepherds going backwards and forwards all the time as well. One eye-opening experience for me was when one of the shepherds had a sheep that was old and wasn't going to live very much longer. And so they sacrificed, or they didn't sacrifice it, they killed it next to the trench where we were working, saying the appropriate prayers so that it was halal. And then the next day when the workers came up with their break, of course, there was mutton. And so we got to eat the sheep that had been killed right next to the trench. So, I mean, a lot of these experiences, as you can see, would have been very eye-opening, but an amazing experience. Some more of the temple itself. In the large photo here, we have column bases and then fallen columns coming down. We have parts of the architrave. We have quite a lot of altars from around this temple. So here is one standing, and on the right, then there's images of two different altars. The top one is the one in the photograph, stood probably about 2 feet high, maybe a bit taller. The lower one is only about 3 inches tall. So it's a tiny little votive altar that would have been given as a gift to the goddess or the gods worshipped here. I didn't put in, and this was bad of me, I didn't put in a reconstruction of the facade of the temple, but I've got a reconstruction of the plan of the temple up top here. So it would have had 6 columns along the front, and then a triangular pediment. So if you think about your typical sort of Greek or Roman looking temple, that's what it would have looked like from the front. However, in terms of proportions, it was very short and squat. It was very much broader than it was long, which is a traditional Semitic temple design rather than a Greco-Macedonian one. So again, while it looks Greek from the front, once you get inside, it's not. Various statue pieces that have been found in the temple complex. The top left here, we have elbow or knee pieces made out of marble, and then we have a marble foot, a large foot. We get lots of marble fragments where we can discern what it is that we're looking at. All of them are body parts, none of them are clothing. So what we think is that we would have had what's called an acrolithic statue, which is where it would have had perhaps a mud or a stucco body around a wooden frame that would have then been covered with clothes, and only where the flesh was exposed with the fragments, or would have actually been built out of marble. We're a long way from any marble sources, and electrospectrometers have been used to discern that the marble that we have on the site actually comes from the Greek islands. So it's been transported a long way in order to build parts of the statue. We have part of another foot down there at the bottom. That one's made out of limestone. We have this wonderful head, nicknamed Jebel Man, who is neither particularly Greek nor particularly Semitic in form. You can see, hopefully, in the photo down the bottom here, where he's in profile, he has a beard that comes down over his chin, but not over his mouth. That's okay, you get that on Greek coins at the time. He's wearing an earring, which the Greeks would have seen as particularly Oriental. And his hair is in a big long plait coming at the back of his head. So again, not a way that most Greeks would have been depicted. But curiously enough, the way that the Greek god Apollo is depicted, with a long plait coming down over his shoulder. So we have different features going on here. We don't know whether we are looking at a sculpture of a person, whether we're looking at a sculpture of a god. It's very unclear. All we have is the badly damaged head. At the top here, we have the figure nicknamed Jebel Baby, because it looks like a jelly baby head, essentially. Made out of marble, but it looks like it must have been offcuts of marble that have then been reworked into a fairly rude, rudimentary sort of sculpture. So you can see that there's all sorts of different styles being produced by the people living here. My favorite one of all, though, that was discovered in 2005 is Jebel Bint. So obviously Jebel Baby and Jebel Man. So the third one that we found had to be nicknamed Jebel Girl. It's probably a Beetle. You can see here the photo of what he, she, it looks like, and then the scale there with the two finders. And incidentally, having a look at the worker here on the left, you can see the tattoos on her face, which are something that you find amongst the Bedouin population that you don't find amongst other populations in this area. But yes, Jebel Bint is an absolutely remarkable little sculpture, just made out of local limestone, but probably a Beetle, which were the traditional pre-Greek statues in the area that were seen to be a temporary house for God. So literally Beit is house and El is God, so the house of the God. It's a great little, really unique sculpture. And again, not something you would expect to find in a Greek temple. To the east of the temple, where you'd normally expect to find a blood altar, we found the base of an altar with a drain immediately below it. And we think that this links in with the worship of the Greek goddess Atargatis and the rituals that were carried out at the big sacred pool at Membij, that I was speaking about earlier, Hierapolis. So they would sacrifice water, they would sacrifice grain cakes and burn incense rather than blood sacrifice to Atargatis. So below this drain, we have elaborate drainage channels then underneath the temple foundations that would have taken water miraculously away. So it wouldn't be seen again. And you can understand in a particularly arid, dry environment, you can understand the concept of you're giving water, you're sacrificing fresh water to ensure that the rains are going to come as part of the fertility rituals in the area. So looking then at our temple, and again, just photos of one of my teams that I worked with, the foundations of the temple itself, one of my workers, Turkey, covering a storage jar there at the temple. The facade is Greek, the plan is Syrian. We have an acrolithic statue, which is typically Greek, but then we also have the Beetle, and then we have Jebel Baby and Jebel Man, which don't really fit within a Greek context either. We don't have any official writing at the site. We don't have any inscriptions or anything like that. What we do have are the handles of jars called amphorae, which have the names of people stamped into them. And those names are written in Greek, but the names themselves are Syrian names. We have names like Absalma, which translates to the servant of Salma, and Margates, the child of Euphrates. So very clearly indigenous names that are being written in a Greek form. And then we have the altars, which don't conform to traditional Greek altars as well, with blood sacrifice. The altar that we had up on the governor's palace in the Acropolis that was a blood altar. The altar that we have down at the temple itself is not. So once again, Jebel Khalid is just standing there, I guess, as the epitome of the history of Syria, in that you have continuous mixing and continuous different influences coming backwards and forwards. It's nice to end talks on a high note, but unfortunately, my talk doesn't. The postscript is what sort of happened, I guess, a little bit to Syria since the outbreak, or since the Arab Spring, and then the outbreak of the Civil War, and then the war with Daesh, or ISIS, or IS, or ISIL, however you want to call them. I can only talk, and I think I will talk very briefly about the human impact at the end, because I'm really not qualified to talk with any personal experience, obviously, of that. But I can talk just briefly about the heritage and the culture that's been lost because of the war. At the top, we have the Old Souk, again, one of the oldest marketplaces in the world. Aleppo and Damascus both vie for the claim of being the oldest continually inhabited cities anywhere in the world. And so both of their souks, their marketplaces, are particularly old and important culturally as well as historically. That, of course, was badly damaged in the fighting between the rebel groups who were holding Aleppo and the government forces. So you can see my photo at the top compared to a more recent photo below. The map on the right-hand side shows the division between major forces as they were in September 2015. So this red area is the control of Daesh, or Islamic State. So that's areas that they firmly controlled. Jebel Khalid is just here in the center of the big lump at the top. Membij is just here, again, in the center of that IS-controlled area. And so we have, yes, a terrible situation occurring here. We don't know what the site is like anymore, what damage has been done to the site. We know certainly that all of our stores, the archaeological stores, have all been looted and destroyed. So all of that content is lost from, 25 years worth of work at the site itself. The green areas were the areas in September 2015 controlled by the Kurds and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Yellow areas are other rebel groups, and then sort of the gray areas are controlled by government forces. So that was in 2015. Palmyra, down here, was in the news quite a lot. A lot of you may have heard about it. The Grand Temple of Bel, that I can only say that I was incredibly privileged to have been able to visit. My photo at the top there. The photo below shows what it looks like today. So the entire temple was destroyed, and that's been confirmed since that happened, obviously. The chief archaeologist for the site was publicly beheaded, and his body hung from one of the standing columns in the theatre at the site. So a complete destruction of a very intentional destruction of the archaeology and the archaeological heritage there at Palmyra. The site of Apamea, which is down in this area here, was destroyed in conflict between rebel groups, or has been very badly damaged in conflict between rebel groups and the government forces. Again, my photo at the top, a more recent photo of part of the destruction below with bombs going off. This satellite photo, I think, is truly eye-opening. So July 2011 is the photograph at the top of what the site of Apamea looked like. The modern name is Apamea. The ancient name is Apamea, named after a Seleucid queen. You have a main colonnaded walkway down the center, and then all the rest of this area was city. Okay, but a lot of it's still uncovered. The photograph, once the war had gotten started in earnest in 2012, each of those dots on that lower photograph, if you can make them out, are looting pits. So the site has been systematically looted. I can't say with any confidence of what was happening amongst other rebel-controlled areas, but certainly in areas where Daesh were the authority, they were quite happy for small finds, small pieces of archaeology, not to be destroyed. They made a great show of destroying temples and columns and statues. But small things like coins, like statuettes, like cylinder seals, they're quite happy for those to be sold on the black market. One of the major hubs for that industry was Membij, that we were talking about earlier, and from there material was being sold on through Turkey. And Daesh were happy with that because they were taking a 20% cut. They put a cum or a tax on all antiquity sales. So the sales of antiquities on the black market were funding their reign, as it were. So the last thing is just a friend's journey. So this is one of my friends from Abu Galgal. I was having contact, and I still have contact with him sort of every few months. In 2015, by February, Daesh, or IS, had control of Abu Galgal. In March, his best friend was killed by IS after being tortured for 3 months, and he was killed publicly in the village square. When I asked what it was that he'd done, his crime was that he was flirting with his fiancée, and that this young man had said that his fiancée was as beautiful as Allah. And for that, he was taken away and tortured for 3 months and then publicly executed. The week after that, my friend fled the village. He couldn't live there anymore. And he went to Mersin in southern Turkey, but he couldn't find any work. In August of that year, he then moved to Istanbul and started working in a laundry. But by November, the only work that he could get was working in a factory doing hard labor. And this is a university-educated English teacher, effectively. But the only work that he could find was working in a factory. He returned to Abu Galgal in December 2017. So remember, this is when Daesh were on the back foot. Abu Galgal then falls to the Syrian Democratic Forces, led by the Kurds, which, even though we in the West, we do consider the Kurds to be sort of the heroes of the ground war in Syria. For the people of Abu Galgal, it's another occupation. They didn't like having Daesh there. You can see a message there from 2015 from my friend. He's saying that the people hate IS so much that they hope that the Air Force will destroy all of them, even if everybody in the village dies in the process. That they still see the occupation of the Kurds as an occupation. He has told me that what most people in the village actually want is for the Turks to extend their so-called buffer. The Turks are holding, I believe, Membij, but Abu Galgal is still being held by the Kurds. The story gets slightly happier in that he married in 2018 and now has a family of his own, some lovely daughters. But even though he is university educated with degrees in teaching, he speaks fluent English, he speaks Turkish, he speaks Kurdish, as well as Arabic. He can't work teaching because there's nobody to pay him. The wages are so low as a teacher. So he's finding that he's working as a blacksmith instead to try and make ends meet. His wife works 2 days a week as a nurse, and she is paid much more working in Membij as a nurse. So you can see that it's not a happy story, but it ends on a note, I suppose, of some normality is returning, but it's still not what it was before the war. So on that fairly somber note, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's anybody left listening, and if you've got any questions for me, share.
Thanks, Nick. I suppose we'll open to the floor first. There are a few comments and questions that I can bring in, but if anybody has put a wee question in and still wants to ask that question, I would invite you to unmute now and ask Nic yourself, and I'll pick up the rest. Would that do?
Nic, thank you very much indeed. My name's Anne Brown. My daughter's just back from working for 18 months in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley. So what you've presented today has just been absolutely fascinating and informative, and a great sort of oversight of the lengthy history of this area. But one question I particularly was interested in is, would you be able to go back to one of your maps and show us where the Kurds have originated from? Because we hear of the Kurds arising in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and so on, and what's their origin, and so on. The reason I ask is some Kurdish families have arrived here, as well as some Arab families, and would be just interested to know a wee bit about the difference and the relationship between the two peoples.
Yep, I did this badly. I should have just started with the first map, but I started at the end. Right, so the Kurdish people are a discrete ethnic group. They are different to Arabs. They see themselves different to their Arab neighbors, speak a different language. With the partition of the Ottoman Empire, you have the area that is often known as Kurdistan being split between Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. So can you see my mouse here?
Yes.
Yep. So it's this area here, which is often referred to as Kurdistan, and it sort of extends down across the Iranian border as well. I can't tell you the exact origins of the Kurds, not with any authority. In antiquity, in the Greco-Roman period, there was a separate state here known as Commagene, and Commagene, the people of Commagene were descended from Iranians who had settled in the area. And they were closely related to the Armenians as well. So they saw themselves, even in antiquity, as distinct from the neighboring Aramaic people in Syria and Cappadocians and Phoenicians and people from Turkey. So the problem, of course, it's a really big issue with the Kurds. But the problem is that to the south of the Turkish border, they have received support from the West. They received support in the West in the fight against Saddam Hussein. They received support in the West against the fight against Daesh. In Turkey, they're seen as a terrorist organization because there have been groups fighting for Kurdish independence or Kurdish autonomy for some time. So what, oh, sorry, I'm trying to stop my share. How do I stop my share?
Still there at the moment, Nic? Oh, there you
go. Yes, so the problem with the Kurds is that because they don't have a homeland of their own, and they have been fighting for autonomy in southern Turkey, they have been identified as terrorists by the Turkish government, who of course are our NATO allies. So when you're supporting Kurds on one side of the border and supporting their enemies on the other side of the border, it makes for a tricky political situation. Yes, but perhaps, I don't know if anybody else here has a more informed knowledge of the current situation with Kurds, but that's how I understand it. And of course, with the Kurdish forces being the major force behind the Syrian Democratic Forces, they now have some degree of autonomy in northern Syria as well, because they've tried to hold on to the territory that they took off Daesh to hold some sort of autonomy against the Syrian government. So there's some sort of autonomy in northern Iraq, some sort of autonomy in Syria, and they're looking for autonomy in Turkey.
Okay, is there anyone else that wants to unmute and ask a question that they had on the chat? I know, Jeff, you had a question on the chat, as did Lekin. So just wondering if that's maybe been answered already through the talk, or if you'd like to ask any further questions on that.
I had a couple of questions. One of them was nearly scared to ask, but it was a wee family that had cooked you dinner, you were saying, and I was just wondering, were you still in touch with them? Did they get out okay, or?
Yes. So they, while still protecting people's identity, obviously, because if this is going to be filmed and whatnot, some of them made it into Turkey. Some of them made it to Lebanon. 3 of the children still live in the village, and one of them has moved to Membij since the official end of the war. So they have been dispersed, more or less. There is a chance that they will come back together, but the situation there, while, from the West, we sit back and go, job done. It's all peaceful. Hopefully, what I've been able to show is it's still incredibly unsettled. And there's still a lot of uncertainty. So if you have some of the family in Lebanon and they're living there sort of successfully, they might not come home anytime soon.
And how difficult was it for you to watch the images in the news, having personal connections in that place? Because it was difficult for the rest of us, on a purely human level. But if there was names, there was faces, there was experiences of people that you had there, how difficult was it for you to watch the news?
Completely.
The past 10 years.
Yeah, completely. And I have made it a point. I used to collect Seleucid coins as part of my doctorate and my studies, and I published quite a lot writing about Seleucid coins. Since the start of the war and the looting, that has stopped. So I've abandoned that completely. Because whereas it was morally malleable previously, it was clear that from that point you couldn't touch it. And I've made it a point that every month I give, depending on what I've got available, I give a decent amount of money to UNHCR's Syrian appeal. But yeah, completely heartbreaking to see it happening.
Legan, did you want to ask Nick some of the questions you had in the chat?
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to everybody. I think I put quite a bit in the chat there, so I can't remember. The last one I put there is about whether it's a myth or it's true that Africa is actually bigger than Europe put together, and Asia as well. I wonder if you can shed the light on that, because the map that we see is actually screwed that, is so small compared with Europe and stuff. So
no, that is absolutely correct. If you look at most world projections, you'll see that Greenland is sort of the size of Africa, and that's simply not the case. Africa is an enormous continent, and Europe is so small. But in most map projections, for various reasons that I'm not going to go into, partly because of time and partly because I don't know it with enough authority, but yeah, projections tend to show Europe as bigger than it should be.
Thank you very much. Just to tag along that of Brian's point in the chat as well. I mean, again, all this stuff created the sense that people from Africa, especially Black people, are nothing but no sense, nothing. But the point I was trying to make there is the fact that the more we have a platform like this to actually look at all this stuff, the more every one of us will be educated, the more we'll be able to live together and support each other. There's only one race, that is human race. And for the fact that somebody up there, depending on your politics, that he decided, or maybe she decided to create us, to create us differently, put us in different parts of the world, know what he or she is doing. And the more we can actually, I don't know whether I mentioned this during the last session, that we use both hands to watch each other, then it becomes more clean. But if you are using one hand, it's not going to clean. Therefore, the more we all can work together, have a conversation together, even if my language is not understood by yourself, we go extra mile to get somebody who can, speak on my behalf, whatever I'm relating, trying to talk to you about, then we all can live peacefully. We all can grow, together and stuff like that. My last point to Nick is that I will be very happy if, as you said, that you don't have that knowledge or you can't speak to the facts that I asked that question. I'd like to know more about it. And if you are able to point me to somebody who will educate me, I will appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thanks, Lakin. I just wanted to ask if anyone else either had a question in the chat or has a question for Nick now. All good. Okay. Nick, thanks so much. I find it really, the first time I heard you talk about the movement of people, and especially from that region of Syria, was really moving for me in terms of the seat of civilization. I've often heard it called that, and especially from the Syrian families that are living in Port Stewart now. They're immensely proud of Syria and their country, and that whole idea of being the seat of civilization, and to see that movement of people up from that area into the West and into Northern Ireland has been great as part of these talks in terms of kind of challenging the kind of stereotype and the kind of language around newcomers. Who are the newcomers? And I appreciate Naomi's, obviously her talk around the history of minority ethnic people in Northern Ireland too. So thank you for that. For my part, I really appreciate that knowledge. I just wanted to say thanks again to everyone that's been involved in this series, to Nick, to Lekin and Khan, to BMCA and Kumila, and to Naomi and Belfast Islamic Centre. It's been such a pleasure and an honour to work with you guys on this, and thank you again to the funders. So myself, our Ethnic Minority Support Project is funded through MEDF, and CRC funded these series of lectures and talks. So thanks so much for that. I'm going to pop a little link into the chat. It's for evaluation. That's the word that I love to kind of repeat to everybody after these kind of amazing programs. We need you to complete the evaluation. So the link is in the chat if you want to click into it. I've also sent it out via email, both the online version and the normal Word document. And if you would indulge me, I have one little thing that I would really like to do with you guys. I'm just going to put it into the chat very quickly. I think there's been just a lot of really powerful and amazing talks in this series, and I wanted to finish with a little Minty diagram. So I've popped on the link there. You can see it, www.minty.com. If you can click into that link, that will bring you to a question that I'd love you to ask, and I'm going to display the results in real time here so that you can see it. So the question is, what is your energy and mood having completed the series of workshops? So if you can click into that link and pop in a word, there you go. We can see one arriving already, so thoughtful. You'll see people's reactions as they are shared on screen. So we'll just give a couple of wee minutes for those to pop up. Okay. Enlightened, thank you. Motivated, inspired, thank you. Okay. And as you see the words getting bigger, it means that more people are putting that forward as their word. So thoughtful is getting very big there. We're doing a lot of thinking about it, which is great. And hopefully those thoughts will go forward into actions. So energetic for the partnerships, brilliant, good, motivated, enlightened, inspired. So as I will leave that on the screen as a finisher. So whenever you have clicked in and put your word in, and please then click into the evaluation. But I'll leave this online and we can see the words appearing. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll be in touch with work going forward as well. Humbling, another good word. Okay, inspired. So what I'll do, folks, is whenever the Mint Day is finished, I'll send a little copy out to everybody as well. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyable.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Lisa, and everybody. It's been fantastic.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Estelle. Thank you.